Welcome to the channel where you get an old man's opinion from a biblical perspective. Whether you always agree with us or not, we would ask that you would take the time to like, to subscribe, to listen, and to comment on our videos. Remember, opinions are a whole lot like nostrils. Almost everybody has at least two or three. With that said, let's get on with today's opinion. As we head in the last few chapters of Ecclesiastes, I want to shift from trying to do a verse by verse and do more of a review or overall view of the chapters because a lot of the themes are reoccurring, and there's some main thoughts that the preacher's trying to get through to the people about life under the sun, and some other aspects of Ecclesiastes. Like all wisdom literature in the scriptures, I think of Proverbs in particular, where he'll a lot of times be just giving just little bullet points of wisdom. Like he may in one verse be speaking of sparing the rod and discipline of children, and in the next verse he might be talking about being slothful at work, and the next verse he might bring out to be aware of loose women. And so all wisdom, but a lot of times it's fragmented thoughts, and you get a little of that in Ecclesiastes too. But having said that, let's just see what we can do, just looking at an overview of chapters 6 and 7. And one of the things I want to point out is that he comes to two conclusions over and over again, and then he'll study a situation and he'll say, "This is what I see." And the first one he comes to, that under the sun, that all is vanity and vexation of the spirit. A lot of times, the uncertainty of the future vexes one's soul. And the second one is that the only certainty under the sun is death. That's the conclusion. We several times throughout the scriptures that we've already read, and here too, he just says one thing is common to us all, and that's that death comes. Doesn't mean that's something we all look forward to, but we're going to see today that sometimes he thinks maybe we should look forward to it. But let's just start with chapter 6, and we'll do the first couple of verses, and then we'll skip along and pick up 2 or 3 more, and then we'll move to chapter 7. So Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verse 1 and 2, this is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. A man of whom God has given riches, wealth, and honor, so that he wants nothing for his soul of all he desires, yet God gives him not power to eat thereof, but a stranger eats it. This is vanity, and it is an evil disease. So Paul looks at this and he says, Solomon looks at this and he says, I've witnessed people who built and worked their whole lives, and then they didn't get to enjoy what they'd earned. We say that today sometimes. We see someone who works and puts away and tries to save for when they're older. And sometimes they'll even work past retirement age to try to have enough to live on. And then they retire, and then in just a few months they pass away and never get to enjoy all the fruits of their labor that they laid up. And Solomon looks at that and just says it just seems wrong. It just seems wrong. And understand that one of the reasons it just seems wrong is because we live under a curse. All of this talked about in Ecclesiastes, all this frustration and all this vanity and vexation and this feeling of we can't accomplish anything is because of the curse in Genesis chapter 3. And that curse is because man sinned. So let's go on and look at, let's just skip down to verse 7, for instance. It says, all the labor of a man is for his mouth, and yet the appetite is not filled. So, and we may read that and think in the King James it says mouth, but he's talking about everything that we do is to try to satisfy our appetites, our desires, our lust. It uses the term lust a lot of times. Uh, Everything that man does, he says it's never filled. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. Those are the three main things that men work to try to fill those voids. He tries to fill the lust of the eye, tries to fill with the lust of the flesh, and he tries to fill the pride of life. But no matter what he does, the more he works at it, the more he has, the more he works. He's never filled. He's never satisfied. Uh, in James chapter 4, it talks about uh, the first 3 or 4 verses talks about you have fightings, and he's talking about in the church, but you have fighting and war among you, and you try to accomplish this, you can't accomplish this, and then in verse 2, I think it is. Let me look. I might have one of them written down here. Uh, yeah, in verse 2 of James chapter 4, it says that you have not because you ask not, because you're not asking God for it. But then he goes immediately to verse 3. He says, you ask and you receive not because you ask amiss, so that you may consume it on your own lust or your own desires. So he says, you try to do all this and that, and you can't accomplish it, and you don't receive. And the reason you don't get what you're trying to accomplish is because you don't stop and ask for it. You don't ask God for it. And he says, but then you ask, and you still don't receive it. And the reason you don't receive it is because you're trying to fill your desires, your appetite, the things that you want. Even in our churches, we'll many times pray and work and try to accomplish things that we want to get done in the church, but maybe God doesn't want to get it done. You know, in our churches, we need to somehow grow in our attitudes that all we care about is getting done what God wants done. And so let's move on let's look at verse 12. He says, for who knows what is good for a man in this life? All the days of his vain life which he spendeth as a shadow. For who can tell a man what shall be after him under the sun? I want to read that one more time. For who knows what is good for a man in this life? All the days of his vain life which he spends as a shadow. For who can tell what shall be after him? So he says, who can tell what's best for a man to do? You know, I remember raising when my children were younger, and I would think, man, we've got to discipline them, and we need to do this, and we need to do that to get them to grow into the kind of people that God would want them to be. And then I would see somebody else that maybe was a lot more laxed or had a different approach, and I think, man, those kids are going to be awful. And in the end, who can tell which way works the best? I would see, you know, I would be surprised that this family has kids that turned out great, and I thought, man, those are going to be awful. And this one over here I thought was going to be great, and they turned out to have problems. So who can tell what's best for a man? You know, who can tell? Is it better for a man to work hard and try to put up some treasures in this world for his family, and or is it better just to lay back and say, you know, I'm not worried about this stuff. All I care about is, you know, getting by and enjoying my family. Either way might be right. Who can tell? And that's what he says here. For who knows what is good for a man in this life? For who can tell a man what shall be after him under the sun? And he throws that under the sun in there because, again, he's going back to the meaninglessness of everything under the sun. Who can tell what's right and wrong under the sun? Because there's no meaning to it if this is all there is. Let's move on to chapter 7. It says, I want to look at Uh, uh, we'll do first 1 and 2, and then we may do another one. It says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all man, and the living will lay it to his heart. And then skip down to verse 4. For the heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning, but the heart of the fools is in the house of mirth. So in the first verse, he says that he compares precious ointment. He says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death better than the day of birth. What? Who can possibly think that? But the thing about it is, he's looking at the trials and tribulations that we live through in this old world. Uh, the 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 curse that we live under. And if you'll think back, I was preparing some remarks for a funeral, and but let me, instead of using this gentleman, let me just think of my parents who were born in the 20s. They were born in the 20s, near the end of the Roaring 20s. Then they went directly into the Great Depression. Then they come out of the Great Depression. The World War II is basically what ended the Great Depression. They lived through World War II. Then my father was in the Korean conflict, and then right after the Korean conflict came Vietnam, and then we know all these more recent conflicts and wars, and their whole lives they've seen trouble, they've seen sorrow. I mean, they've had happiness mixed in with that, but this whole life is a curse. It's cursed. It was cursed in Genesis chapter 3. So he says, and he goes on to say, verse number 2, it is better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. So he says, it's better to go to the house of mourning, which would be your funeral parlors, than to the house of feasting. Why? Because that's the end of all men. That's the thing we need to be. We need to understand that we're heading toward a deadline, and we need to take this life that we're living seriously, and that what happens then. Just read verse 4 again. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the fool is in the house of mirth. Where's your heart? Where's your heart? When you go to a funeral and you sit and you ponder and somber, and your heart's in here, and you reflect on what is important in this world. I'm going to skip down to verse 15. It says, all things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There's a just man that perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man that prolongs his life in his wickedness. Again, kind of a fragmented thought process here. He comes up with, this is an evil that I've seen, that there's a righteous man that dies young, and then there's an evil man that lives to be 100. And we've seen that in our lifetimes, and we go, why? Why is this way? Verse 16 and 17, but be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why should you destroy yourself? So he says, don't be overly righteous, and don't make yourself overly wise, because why should you destroy yourself? You're working and working to do these things. But then the next verse, he says almost exactly the opposite. Be not over much wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why should you die before your time? So he's saying, strike a balance. Strike a balance. Don't be overly righteous or overly wise, and don't be overly foolish. Strike a balance. Then to conclude this thing, he asked a question. Let me get my step here right. He asked some questions concluding this thing. Verse 21 of chapter 7 says, also take heed unto all the words that are spoken, lest you hear thy servant curse thee. For oftentimes also thy own heart knoweth that you likewise hast cursed. So I want to throw this in before we get to the end of it. He says, don't pay any attention when you hear your servant saying something bad about you. I don't know if any of you all ever worked in supervision, but you need to have thick skin when you're in supervision, because sooner or later you're going to find out that people say bad things about people in supervision. It's just the way it is. And you say, he says, don't get concerned about that. You know yourself, you've said something bad about the people that's over you, right? So even if it's not supervision type thing, so you find out someone's gossiped or said something bad about you, I bet you've said something bad about folks too. So don't let that bother you too bad. Then he goes on, he says, verse 25, the preacher says, I applied my heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, and to know the wickedness of folly, even the foolishness of madness. I applied my heart to that. I said, I'm going to find out why things are wicked. And then he goes on and he starts, and he says he checks it out among men and women, and he concludes it in verse 30. He answers himself. He says, lo, this only have I found. So at first, let me try to tie this together a little bit. Verse 25 says, I applied my heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, and to know the wickedness of folly, even the foolishness of madness. And then he gives a couple of examples, but then in verse 29 he says, lo, this I have found, that God has made man upright, but they, man, have sought out many inventions. And I looked that up. Let me read this, what it says in the Applied Bible. The Amplified Bible. It says, behold, I have found only this as a reason. God made man upright and uncorrupted, but they, both men and women, have sought out many devices for evil. He made Adam and Eve in the garden upright, without sin. That's how he made man. But man, he says, has searched out many inventions, many ways to sin. That reminded me of Romans chapter 1, where at the beginning of Romans chapter 1, he talks about that God can be known by everyone because of the invisible things of God are clearly seen. And therefore people are without an excuse, because they know there's a God. And then he goes on down through there and says, but because people have worshiped and served the creature more than the creator, he gives them over to reprobate minds. And he talks about the homosexuality problems, and he talks about how that God gave them over, men with men, burning in their lust one toward another, women leaving the natural use. But then he goes on in verse 28, Romans 1:28 through 31, and I just want to read it. This is out of the King James. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. Now, these are people that know the truth, it says earlier. It says earlier in the chapter. They know the truth. But it says, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. They were filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who, knowing the judgment of God, these people doing all these things know the judgment of God, who knowing the judgment of God, but they which commit such things are worthy, that people that commit such things are worthy of death. Not only do they the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Ecclesiastes says that God made man upright, but man came up with all kinds of devices, schemes, or inventions to do evil. And because of that, if we went back to the first part of the chapter, he says that going to the house of mourning, that the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth, because when we're born into this sinful, corrupt world. And as long as we live under the sun, we will live in this sinful, corrupt, cursed world. The only escape from it is through Jesus Christ. We'll talk to you soon. Good night.